Okay, it's just about 1 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. So welcome to our fall meeting press conference, The Impacts of COVID-19 on People and the Environment as Seen from Space. I'm Lauren LaPuma from the AGU Media Relations Office, and I'll be moderating today. So our panelists today are Ned Baer from the University of California, Santa Barbara, Timothy Newman from the US Geological Survey, and Nima Pahlavan from NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. So we'll begin with panelists giving brief presentations describing their findings, and then we'll open it up for questions from reporters. We'll end after 45 minutes or when there are no more questions. And just some housekeeping stuff. The slides from this presentation will be available after it's over in the Fall Meeting Media Center. And a recording of this press conference will be posted to AGU's YouTube channel under the playlist Fall Meeting 2020 Press Conferences. And immediately after the press conference ends, after the Q&A portion, we'll open up an informal 30-minute discussion room via Zoom. So this is to provide reporters with an additional opportunity to chat with the panelists in a more informal setting, to interact with them directly and continue the discussion that will start in the press conference. And so links to the discussion room and the slides and the YouTube channel are all posted in the chat, and I'll post them again at the end just in case you need them, so feel free to stick around for that if you like. And if you have any questions at all about our press conferences, you can email us at news@agu.org. And with that, I will turn it over to our first panelist.
Very good, thank you. My name is Tim Newman. I am the program coordinator for National Land Imaging within the US Geological Survey. If you can move to the next slide. I have a number of examples I'd like to point out where Landsat's been used to help see change on the surface of the Earth that may or may not be due to COVID-19 impacts. So Landsat goes all the way back to the 70s. Most of you have heard of the system, almost 50 years now of data that's been collected about the land surface. It's multispectral data. So we're looking at data, not just that your eye can see, but looking at shortwave infrared, thermal infrared, and other bands that allow you to see change on the surface of the Earth that your eyes may not be able to see. But I will say that there are many confounding factors to determining what is the cause of change on the land surface. So you can see that the land has changed, but there can be a number of factors behind the cause of that change. Landsat is a well-known, long-term, and well-calibrated satellite data record. So that allows you to tease out some of the more subtle changes that happen on the Earth's surface that you may not be able to see with less well-calibrated data sets. Next slide. So I'm going to move quickly through a number of examples. This is historically dengue fever and hantavirus were two examples where Landsat was used. These are space images that were used to see change that was caused, that may have contributed to dengue fever and hantavirus in these two locations. Landsat maps temperature. So on the left side, you can see where red is higher temperature, and dengue fever tends to happen in the tropics and areas that are where you have higher temperature and lower elevation. And on hantavirus, you can also see change due to rainfall that has occurred where you have greening of vegetation. And so you can see that there were changes on the right side where you have red, where there would be more of a increase in hantavirus rodent population, and then the blue would be less. So you can use satellite imagery to actually see the effects of disease on the surface of the Earth. Next slide. But determining what is what has caused that change and what hasn't, in fact, looking specifically at COVID-19 is a very complex task. So this is work from Brancalian that looks to try to map all of these different aspects of COVID and where you might be able to see impact on the land surface. If you zero in the next slide, you can see that more specifically the immediate impacts. You can see that if there's been a relaxation of legal enforcement of forestation, that can lead to biomass burning, an increase in biomass burning, more pollution, more respiratory problems, and then so you can see how COVID could potentially have an impact on deforestation in these areas. But that well-calibrated data record allows you to figure out, in some cases, what are those impacts of COVID. Next slide. So we know from watching deforestation in Brazil that there has been some acceleration So COVID is a potential contributor to that deforestation. Brazil uses Landsat imagery and other data sets to monitor the rainforest. So you can see with these two images from June above and September below, where there's been significant change on that land surface. And it could be due to land policies that have been enacted within Brazil. It could be due to less enforcement of forested areas, as I mentioned earlier. So there could be many causes, but it's clear that there has been some acceleration, some change in this area of Brazil. Next slide. But in other countries in Amazonia, Peru and Colombia, for example, there's also been a slight decrease in deforestation and deforestation alerts in those countries since COVID hit. And so in some cases, it's a little harder to see why would it impact Brazil, for example, and not Peru and Colombia. So that's more work that has to be done to understand why there would be these differences. Next slide. Deforestation in the tropics has been observed for many years. You can see with these images, you can see changes in Sumatra, where on the left side, you see a period from January of 2019 to January of 2020, and then the next year, January 20 to October of 2020. And you can see where there's been accelerated deforestation in those pink areas on the right side since COVID hit, which you didn't see in the previous year. And so also that's observed in the Congo, for example. So a Landsat image from space can detect, for in this case, a little more deforestation that's occurring in those particular countries. Next slide. Agriculture is also tracked pretty closely. So the World Food Program has said that there could be more people placed into chronic hunger because of COVID. When you watch harvesting patterns across the world, this one in particular is in Spain, you can see that perhaps the harvesting season started a little bit later in 2020 than it did in 2019. And so you can wonder, why was that? Was it due to COVID, not having as many laborers out in the field potentially? Or could it be due to the fact that in 2019, there was more, it was a drought happening that caused earlier harvesting in that year. So all this has to be put together to really pin COVID-19 as the suspect. Next slide. In India, we've been tracking reduced environmental pollution. I think you've all seen stories in the news about that. And this particular study looked at Landsat data, but also looking at field data that's taken on the ground related to water quality and noise ambience. And what we've seen is that there has been decreased temperatures. We see that with our Landsat temperature sensing system, the thermal infrared sensor. And we've also seen improved water quality and reduced noise levels. And those are just examples from a particular area in India. Next slide. Water quality is another one. You're going to hear from Nima in a little bit, but this is just another example of where Landsat 8 imagery was used to look at this particulate matter, reduction in particulate matter since COVID hit, traced to another place in India. And I think the next slide is my last slide. I just wanted to summarize that Landsat and many other Earth observations help support environmental and public health. We do need to better understand the connection between policies on the ground and diseases like COVID, and trying to pin down why did these changes happen on the Earth's surface. So more research is needed to better clearly attribute these changes to COVID. And that concludes my talk.
Nima, you can go ahead if you're ready.
Sure, I am. Hi, everyone. My name is Nima Pahlavan. I work for NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. Today, I would like to talk to you about impacts of COVID-19 lockdown on surface water quality conditions. This work has been done in collaboration with our colleagues at Columbia University. This is still evolving. It's an ongoing research. So today, I'll be presenting to you just a glimpse of the work that we have done so far. Next, please. Okay, so our primary research hypothesis has been the fact that water quality condition improves due to the stay-at-home order. So this is really the driver of the research that we've done over the past couple of months. Next, please. So to enable our research activity, we follow 3 different paths. We produce water quality proxies. These proxies include chlorophyll A, which is the primary pigment in phytoplankton, total suspended solids, or the amount of particles in the water column, and turbidity, which is the inverse of water clarity. We also identified anomalies using climatological maps that we produced, and we ended up evaluating and validating our anomaly maps that we generated from satellite images using in situ measurements. Next, please. So we looked at multiple locations across the country: San Francisco Bay, New York City, Chesapeake Bay. We also looked at an international site in Venice. The primary source of data for our effort has been Landsat 8 and Sentinel-2 data. Next, please. So here are a couple of anomaly maps that has been generated based on chlorophyll A data over San Francisco Bay right after COVID-19 lockdown from April 3rd to May 24th. The red and white colors are indication of changes, and the blue color indicates no changes. So as you can see, there's, for instance, just for the April 14th timeframe, Landsat 8 has been able to capture significant changes in the amount of chlorophyll A for that particular date. However, from what we know and from what we understand in San Francisco Bay Area, we know that the driver behind these significant changes in all these large scale maps is primarily environmental conditions, including precipitation, wind status, dynamics of tidal forcing. Next. So yeah, basically this is what I was trying to say. So most of the changes that we've seen, and I'm showing here, are driven by environmental factors, including primarily precipitation. There's been more rainstorm over that time frame in San Francisco Bay Area that caused more significant amount of chlorophyll A for those particular dates. Next, please. So given the fact that it's very difficult to tease out impacts of COVID-19 in water quality condition, we decided to look at local regions. And one of those regions was New York City, basically a region where subtle COVID-19 impacts can be isolated from environmental or physical forcing. So just this example here is showing Manhattan. We're focusing on Manhattan area. It has over 2 million commuters that stayed at home right after COVID-19 lockdown. And one of the consequences is that sewage discharge originated from these, all the businesses in Manhattan area was expected to be significantly reduced. So what I'm showing here is, can you go back, please? Yeah. So what I'm showing here is that this sewage discharge, or treated sewage discharge from 2 sewage treatment plant at location 2 and location 4. Location 2 being Western Manhattan area and location 4 being southeast part of Manhattan. And the blue curves are showing the average, multi-year average sewage discharge that are captured through the in situ measurements. The orange ones are indicating the sewage discharge, the treated sewage discharge from those 2 locations over the COVID-19 period. So you can see that there's a significant change in the trend of sewage discharge at those locations. And this is definitely driven by COVID-19. It's because primarily it's impacting the discharge right after COVID-19 timeframe, which is about end of March, early April. So the question is, can we see these reduction in sewage discharges from satellite data? Next. The answer is yes. So for location 2, or the plant at location 2 and location 4, I'm highlighting here for location 2, which is primarily driven by the sewage discharge from the businesses in the Western Manhattan area, you see a significant drop in the turbidity that we are able to capture from Landsat 8 and Sentinel-2 data. And that's what we're seeing here, really the drop in that discharge. In location 4, because the sewage discharge is sort of shared between Brooklyn area and Eastern Manhattan side, the signal is not as concrete as the one in location 2. So the end of the story is that we're seeing a significant drop in sewage discharge for the Western Manhattan region. Next, please. So overall, we believe that major changes in living patterns are expected to be detectable from space in nearshore areas. And as I showed in the previous slide, there has been significant changes that we have been able to identify using Landsat 8 data in Hudson River. And we're still working on further localizing our analysis in New York region as well as in San Francisco Bay Area to be able to see how exactly COVID-19 has been impacting the surface water quality conditions. And that's all I had.
Okay, Ned, you can go ahead.
Okay, thanks everyone. And thanks to Tim and Nima for those great presentations. I'm going to talk about COVID-19 impacts on snow albedo in the Indus River Basin. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Timbo Stillinger, who's at the University of California, as am I, Carl Ritkers at the University of Colorado, and Mackenzie Skiles at the University of Utah. There's a picture that I took in the upper Salong Valley of India in the Indus Basin. These are some villagers walking to a village from a village called Old Salong to work and to get their groceries and stuff. And that's a gigantic avalanche debris pile, one of the largest I've ever seen, probably 30 meters deep in places. And you can see the terraced landscapes up there, and they go up and down that every day. So it's a rugged place, and we need satellites to assess the snowpack and impacts like that, on it. So next slide, please. So here's another picture of me. This is at a ski resort in India. You can see that the snow gets pretty dirty there, even in March, especially near the roads. And then it's better further from the roads, but still a significant impact. That's a plug for our website, snow.ucsb.edu, if you're interested in more of our research. Next slide, please. So for some background, this is an article from the NASA Earth Observatory, and there's a lot of great research. I was just looking through the posters at AGU on aerosol optical depth and observed changes. You can see that from this graph, in April, when the lockdowns in India began, they had the lowest observations on date, on record for this date, 2016 to 2019. There is shown in the light blue, and you can see that in April there, it's well, the aerosol optical depth is very low. There were a lot of tweets and there are, social media on how the Himalaya were visible from cities like Delhi for the first time in 30 years. This was also true in Kathmandu. You could see the Himalaya, and that's rare. Happened for the first time in memory for a lot of people. So our hypothesis was that the cleaner atmosphere must have had an impact on the snow. Specifically, it's albedo, which is a Latin term for the whiteness or brightness of the snow. Next, please. The take-home point is that the Indus River Basin produces about 95 cubic kilometers of meltwater from snow and ice, and that's from our model, the PARBAL, Parallel Energy Balance model. That water supplies supplies water for 300 million people. And what we found is that the snow and ice was cleaner during the lockdowns by about 36 parts per million. And that doesn't sound like very much, but when you aggregate over the entire Indus Basin, that is equivalent to changing the timing of meltwater for 0.73 to 0.93 cubic kilometers of water. And I want to be clear here. That's not all of Lake Tahoe. It would be equivalent to the top 6 feet of Lake Tahoe, so the controlled portion. So if you look up storage capacity for Lake Tahoe, you might see that. The total storage capacity of Lake Tahoe is more like 150 cubic kilometers because it's one of the deepest lakes in the world. So anyway, that's the Indus, and you can see Islamabad there and New Delhi. And this is a graph of the mean annual snow and ice melt in millimeters. That albedo is probably the most significant driver of, which is why we pay so much attention to it. Next, please. Our methods, so we examined snow cover over the Indus for the past 20 years. We used 2 different models to increase our certainty in our findings, both from the MODIS instrument, the moderate resolution imaging spectrometer, which is coarser spatially than Landsat, which was discussed by Tim and Nima. It's 463 meter pixels, but they're available daily. So we have this incredible 20-year daily record. Both models assume mixtures where the observed is composed of a specific type of snow, okay, having a specific grain size in particular, so the size of the snow crystals and impurity content, and then a snow-free component. So on the graph on the right there, you can see the snow-free is the background in red, and then we observe the blue line, and then the model is fit to that blue line with our specific type of snow and background mixture in black. Next, please. So our results. Both models show 2020 dust levels, which are shown in red, significantly below the mean, which is in black, and near the lowest levels recorded over the 20-year record in gray. It looks like my slides occluding that lower point a little bit, but the width of the lines for the red and the black lines, those represent the uncertainty, okay? And this is 2 different models that we're using, okay? The model on the left, model 1, is our new model called the Snow Property Inversion from Remote Sensing. The model on the right is a model called MODSCAG and Dust and Radiative Forcing on Snow, which is a more mature model. But both show differing amounts of dust on the snow, which is proxying for all pollutants, including black carbon. But they show the same trend, right? Which is that it's some of the lowest observed on record. Next, please. So, however, snow albedo doesn't only depend on dust. It also depends on grain size, which I hinted at earlier. Neither model showed significantly different grain sizes in 2020 from other years. And our uncertainty albedo is around 5%. So it's too high to say that it was significant. The snowpack was significantly brighter in 2020. But there are hints of this. For instance, towards the monsoon there in June, this is the Spires model. You can see that red line for 2020 gets outside of the normal bounds of uncertainty. So there is some evidence for this, but we can't say that it's a significant finding. Next. And that's all I have. Thank you. Again, snow.ucsb.edu, and I'd like to acknowledge our funding sources, which are the University of California, NASA, and NOAA. Thank you.
Okay, so with that, we will open it up to questions from reporters. So reporters, if you'd like to ask a question, please write it into the Q&A box. That's not the chat box, it's separate, it's called the Q&A box. Please write it in and please state your name and affiliation when asking your question. And Liza, my colleague, will pose it to the panel on your behalf. So we can open it up. Liza, do we have any questions?
We do have a couple questions. So starting with Craig Miller has a question for Tim. Can you speak specifically to San Francisco Bay? I've heard your caveats about regional factors, but what do you think the net effects of COVID were on the water quality or other conditions? What do you think was going on?
I would defer to Nima on that question, just given the fact that he's studied San Francisco Bay pretty extensively.
Yeah, sure. Can you repeat the question, please?
Yes. The question is, can you speak specifically to San Francisco Bay? I've heard your caveats about regional factors, but what do you think the net effects of COVID were on the water quality or other conditions? What do you think was going on?
Yeah, great question. So What we've seen is that to be able to better understand the impact of COVID, we have to focus on very local regions, in particular the treatment, sewage discharge, and the facilities and utilities. Those are the areas that we're expecting to see the maximum impact of COVID-19 on surface water quality conditions. At the broader scale, there are, as I mentioned, there are a lot of factors contributing to the changes compared to the normal conditions, from rainstorm, precipitation, dynamics of tidal forcing, wind conditions, wind direction, could all drive changes in water quality conditions. So we have to stay away from those conditions to be able to isolate impact of COVID-19. So it has to do mostly across a broader scale. It has to do with environmental impacts on physical forcing, and local conditions could speak to COVID-19 impact.
Question from Carolyn Gramling from Science News, also for Nima. Can you close the loop a bit on explaining the turbidity data? Assume these locations 2 and 4 are on the Hudson and East Rivers. So that means we're seeing less effluent flow into the Hudson and East Rivers, basically, stirring up the water and or sediments in the river. What do the satellites actually see?
So great question again. So to the western side of Manhattan, the location to the treatment facility at location 2 that is responsible for treating the water from western Manhattan, where a lot of businesses reside, we've been able to see the impact of change in turbidity, and that's really the simplest parameter or proxy that one can see from satellite data. And it simply just isolated the entire effect of other regions, and it was just Western Manhattan area. However, in the other parts of Manhattan where the treated sewage discharge is shared with Bronx or Brooklyn or Queens, we have been able to see less changes in turbidity. And these turbidity data on the ground come from New York Department of Environment, and those are essentially, they're not exactly at the same location as where the treated sewage discharge essentially comes into the East River or Hudson River. So there are caveats into where these turbidity come from. For the Western Manhattan area, location 2, we have the New York Department of Environment turbidity gauge is very close to the discharge location. But for the other regions, in addition to the fact that the discharge is not just coming from a Manhattan area, the turbidity data is not exactly measured at the same location as where the water is being discharged from the treatment plant. So there are some complexities, and we're trying to sort of better understand where to focus on, but initial results are showing interesting impacts due to COVID-19 in Hudson River.
Deborah Warner from Space News asks, why is it important to study COVID-19's impact on people and the environment? For example, does it provide information to help researchers understand climate change, or what would happen if nations reduced?
So I'll kick it off, and I'm sure Nima and Ned might have something they want to say too, but I think just understanding any change that occurs on the Earth's surface helps us understand all change. So if we see a change that's occurring, we can then do the harder work of determining or attribute the change, what caused it and why. And so that helps us learn more about the Earth system, and hence climate change and any of these other factors. So understanding specifically, if we can tease out what change occurred because of COVID-19, it helps us, gives us a better understanding of all change that happens on the Earth's surface.
Thanks. I'll take a stab at that too, Tim. I think I agree with that. I think these changes that we saw with COVID-19 are really dramatic. I mean, something like the air quality, if you've been to a place like Delhi, or even Los Angeles this past year, you understand how much that can affect everyone who lives there. And you know, these changes are dramatic, and I think it's an especially impactful way to reach a wide audience. And we're seeing changes that are often only modeled, or maybe we don't have a complete, the observations, it was so long ago that the air was clean, we really didn't have the satellite record to look at that. So I think it's really a unique opportunity for increasing the impact of the site.
I don't have much to add. It's great responses.
Okay, Rick Lovett asks, how do we use this information for environmental research and regulation after COVID? This is for all panelists.
So one thing that we try to do is projection as well. So when you study change that's happened, especially with Landsat's data record going back 50 years, there's a push now to try to project into the future. What happens if you make a policy change? What happens if a pandemic strikes? What happens if you have a hurricane coming up the coast? And so more and more, I think there's research being done on how you can use historical Earth observation data to project what will happen in the future under some of these scenarios. So I think if that helps with your question, I think there's still a lot of work to be done on that. Projection is never perfect. But imagine if we could prepare for the next pandemic by understanding more clearly what happened during this one.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think it's a glimpse of how a cleaner world could look, and that's a powerful message that is widely understood.
Yeah, from the aquatic perspective, I think we're also very interested in learning how ecosystem would respond to the lower pollution that human being would put out in aquatic ecosystems. And this would be very interesting to see how fisheries and how the economic value of nearshore environments would impact due to the sort of a pandemic happening and the resources be used less frequently.
Deborah Warner from, I think, Science News follows up again with, the San Francisco Bay is closed again last night. Are studies of this region continuing?
Yes, it is continuing. We have been in touch with several of our colleagues with the state to see if there has been any changes reported in their sewage discharges. We're still working with them. But again, just to clarify, there has to be a significant change in the living patterns of human beings to be able to see these COVID-19 signatures in the water, at least, which is what we have seen in the New York City region, where 2 million commuters stopped commuting to stop basically using water in Manhattan area, and that's where we've seen the impact. In San Francisco Bay, if the living pattern is not exactly the same as in New York City, which is really not, that being able to capture those signatures and impacts would be more difficult.
Harvey Leifert, freelancer, asks, in a similar vein, are the panelists willing to make a broad statement that COVID-19 has or has not made a significant impact on the environment?
I guess I could lead off briefly. I think it has had a significant impact, and I encourage you to browse some of the other abstracts and posters and see some of these worldwide, for instance, 20% reductions in aerosol estimates and things like that. So I think a yes is my short answer.
Yes, and that would be my short answer as well. But I would also say it's going to take some time to determine what are the extent of the COVID-19 impacts and effects on the land surface. So there's certainly more research that will need to be done, but I think it's pretty clear it's had an impact.
I concur with those answers. Based on our analysis and research going on in New York City and San Francisco Bay and other regions where there is institute data, we're hoping that to be able to extend our analysis to other regions, other major urban areas, to be able to see if there has been or have been changes in the water quality conditions due to COVID-19. So it's still research ongoing to better understand really the impact of COVID-19.
James Stacy, freelancer, has the question for Tim. You spoke about how Landsat data can reveal short-term impacts of the pandemic. But is Landsat data also being used to identify environmental changes that could contribute to future disease outbreaks, especially zoonotic diseases?
The answer is yes. I think there is a considerable amount of research that's been done to look at conditions associated with these species. For example, increased vegetation resources. So you might say if it's more green, if the imagery you get back is more green in an area, it may lead to an increase in animal populations. For example, I talked about hantavirus and the mouse population, the rodent population in the southwestern United States that could lead to disease outbreaks like hantavirus later. We can also monitor moisture conditions that may relate to mosquito populations. I think I had a dengue fever example as well. So what you can do with this data is you can track trends over time. So if you're living in some of those areas, you're a public health official, you can go back and see what has the moisture level look like over the past couple of years. Is there an increasing trend toward warmer temperatures that may lead to potentially outbreaks of these mosquito-driven diseases that haven't occurred before because now it's warmer, wetter, and so forth. So yes, these are indirect measurements that can contribute to our understanding.
Rick Levitt has another question for Nima. In New York City, what exactly did you measure from space? Turbidity was on the ground, right? What was measured from space?
So from space, from Landsat 8 and Sentinel-2 data, we are able to look at parameters or quantities that impact the quality of water and the color of water in particular. So turbidity is one of those parameters that have a lump sum effect on the quality of the water. It's inverse of clarity. So the more turbid the water is, it's less clear. So it's detectable and it's seenable as viewable from satellite. So yes, we can essentially develop algorithms and models to examine turbidity from the space and essentially match it with the institute data that it's measured on the ground. So what I showed in our time series plots were turbidity and time series of turbidity versus time series of institute turbidity. So they're essentially comparable measures of water quality.
Carolyn from Science News asks a question for Ned. What is the takeaway on the albedo data as far as the impact on water supply downstream? Does this mean there is less melt, so less supply, or slower melt, so more steady supply?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and it's a good one. So most of the snow in the Indus and in most glaciarized areas is actually on top of ice or on top of dry land. So it's going to melt out. Typically, there are places where it sticks around for the whole year. But what the takeaway is, right, is that the snow is going to melt at some point, but it's going to melt more slowly, okay, and change the timing of the water supply. And this is particularly important in areas where they aren't able to control their water supply. For instance, the sort of far western parts of the Indus reach into Afghanistan, right? And the streams just run dry in September, and it's a humanitarian crisis because there's no water. So so that is the take home point, is that the water supply timing would shift. And I guess I'd also mention that shift is to some extent mitigates the climate change impacts. Okay, so the climate change impacts are for earlier melt onset and earlier complete melt out, whereas having a cleaner snowpack causes later melt onset and later melt-out date.
Liza, I think you're muted.
Sorry, it didn't work there. Apologies. Rick Willabit has another question for Nima. You looked at other sites than San Francisco Bay and New York City. Any findings?
We have looked at a couple of other sites, but identifying in situ and ground measurement is very difficult in other regions, and that's why we're primarily focusing on areas that we expect to have in situ measurements to be able to validate our sort of research analysis through satellite data. So we have looked at Venice Lagoon. We're planning to look at the city of Rio de Janeiro and a few other urban areas across the world, but this is still ongoing research, so stay tuned.
Last call for questions. All right, I think that's it then.
Oh, we have one in the chat box, Liza.
In the chat box. Is it at the bottom?
Oh, wait, sorry. That is, oh, sorry, that is not a question.
Okay, great.
That is an from NASA.
Excellent.
Yeah, so I think if that's all the questions, that's it, Liza?
It looks like it. Craig Miller had a follow-up, but he said it was answered. So unless he speaks up and says he still would like to answer that question, I think we're all set.
Yeah, and Craig, if you'd like some more clarification. So this will conclude our formal press conference. So what we will do now is we will open up that informal discussion room in Zoom that I mentioned. So a link to that is in the chat of this event. So you can, I'll leave that up until we're all out so you guys can head over there. So that just will give you the opportunity to talk with the panelists in more detail, talk one-on-one. You guys can actually talk face-to-face over Zoom in there. So thank you again for coming. Thank you to all of our panelists. This was really wonderful. If you have any questions, again, you can email us at news@agu.org. The recording for this press conference will go up in about an hour or so. If you don't stick around for the discussion room, our next press conference will be tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern time, and it will be the Arctic Report Card. So thank you again for joining us, and we will see you later.